There's a version of every story that makes sense at first. The official version, the easy version, the one people accept and move on from. But when you start pulling it apart, piece by piece, you begin to see how it was built. Every choice, every moment, every detail, like bricks laid one at a time. And when you look closer, things start to shift, details don't line up, motives get complicated, and the truth isn't as clean as it seems. This is killer constructions, and this is a story that deserves a closer look. What comes next carries a weight that stays with you. This story includes the killings of multiple women, details of violence, disposal of human remains, and the lasting grief carried by families who spent years waiting for answers. The facts in this case are painful, and the human cost is impossible to overstate. If that kind of material is too much for you tonight, this is the time to step away. But if you are staying, then stay for the women whose lives were taken and for the truth that took far too long to surface. In the end, the thing that unsettles people most is not always the horror itself. Sometimes it is the ordinary shape built around it. The plain house, the daily commute, the familiar street. The routine so fixed and unremarkable that no one thinks to question it. That is part of what makes the story of Rex Heuermann so difficult to look at directly. By every outward measure, there was a structure in place. A family home in Massapequa Park, a career in Manhattan, a schedule, neighbors, clients, bills, arguments, repairs, meals, traffic, weather, the small mechanics of a normal life. And underneath all of that, according to prosecutors and the evidence laid out over time, there was something else, not visible, not obvious, but present in ways that didn't interrupt anything. At least not yet. Long before the headlines, before the searches and indictments and court appearances, there was a boy on a beach. It is late summer in the 1970s at Gilgo Beach on Long Island's South Shore. The air is heavy with salt and sunscreen. Families are packing up for the evening. Coolers are being shut. Towels are snapped out and folded. Children are still trying to get in one last run to the water before being called back. Lifeguard chairs are being stacked. The sky has gone soft with the last gold of the day. And in the middle of that ordinary scene is a teenager named Rex Heuermann, working a summer job, moving equipment, blending into the background like anyone else. Nothing about the moment announces what it will one day stand against. Nothing about it warns you. That is what makes it useful as a point of contrast. Not because it explains anything, it does not. But because ordinary moments can become unbearable in retrospect. They show you how complete the disguise once was. Rex Heuermann was born on March 7th, 1963, and grew up on Long Island in Massapequa Park, in the house that would later become central to the public's understanding of him. He attended Berner High School. Former classmates later described him as tall, awkward, often bullied, and sometimes volatile when pushed. Those recollections are part of the public portrait, but they do not amount to destiny. Many people are mocked as children. Many feel isolated. Many grow up strange, angry, embarrassed, or wounded without ever harming anyone. The danger in stories like this is the temptation to draw a straight line backward, as if the ending was visible from the start. Usually it is not. Usually what exists instead is a collection of traits, habits, grievances, fantasies, and permissions that accumulate in private until they become a pattern. After high school, Heuermann studied architectural technology at the New York Institute of Technology. He built a career around structure, compliance, and the practical language of buildings. He worked in Manhattan and eventually established RH Consultants and Associates, a firm focused on architectural consulting, permitting, and code issues. The work suited a certain kind of mind, measured, procedural, detail-heavy, concerned with systems, access, and what is allowed. In interviews given before his arrest, he spoke about his profession in technical, unembarrassed terms. He was not performing glamour. He talked like a man who had spent years buried in regulations and plans. Clients and acquaintances described him as knowledgeable, even relentless. He cultivated the identity of a person who knew how structures worked. That phrase matters here, though not in the way he likely intended, because this story is also about structure, about compartmentalization, about the architecture of concealment, about how a life can be built in such a way that its visible rooms appear disconnected from the ones no one else enters. He married Asa Ellerup, and together they lived in the Massapequa Park home with their children. To people on the outside, the property was often described as run down, cluttered, and closed off, but it was still just another house in a neighborhood full of houses. He commuted into Manhattan, he worked, he returned home, he paid some bills and fell behind on others. Public records later showed tax troubles and lawsuits, the kind of low-level strain that exists in countless lives and means very little by itself. There were trips out of town, ordinary family logistics, the endless repetition of domestic routine. Even after his arrest, some people who knew him in professional settings spoke with disbelief. That too is part of the pattern in cases like this. Not because disbelief proves innocence, but because normalcy, once established, exerts its own force. People trust what they have already placed in familiar categories. And while that visible life continued, women were disappearing. It is important to say their names carefully, and to say more than their names. Cases like this have a way of reducing victims to geography, to remains, to the shorthand of how they were found. That is one of the lasting violences committed against them. It begins with the person who killed them, but it does not end there. Media repetition can flatten a life until all that survives publicly is the method of death. So the story has to resist that. It has to return them as much as the record allows to themselves. Sandra Costello was 28 years old when she was killed in 1993. She had emigrated from Trinidad and Tobago and was living in New York. Her life, like many lives that do not make the news until tragedy intervenes, was built from ordinary hopes and day-by-day effort, work, family, movement through the city, the practical business of survival. When her body was found in a wooded area in North Sea, she was unidentified. Years passed, then decades. The distance between her death and the identification of her remains is part of the cruelty of the case. Not only was her life taken, but her name itself was separated from her for years. Once investigators connected Heuermann to her killing, the case widened in time. It was no longer just about the bodies found near Gilgo Beach. It suggested something older, an earlier expression of the same capacity for violence. At the time, nothing connected. There was no reason to believe it would. Karen Vergata's story also unfolded across a horrifying stretch of time. She was 34 years old when she disappeared in the mid-1990s. Some of her remains were found on Fire Island in 1996. Other remains were found years later on Long Island near Tobay Beach. For a long time, she existed in the case only as an unidentified victim, known publicly by fragments. That is difficult to hear, and even more difficult to imagine from the position of those who loved her. To know someone is gone but not know where. To know remains were found but not know they were hers. To live inside that suspended state where grief cannot fully settle because identity itself has not been restored. When she was finally identified through genetic genealogy, it was not closure in any simple sense. There is no clean closure in a case like this, but it was a restoration of name, and name matters. The details were different, but not different enough. Valerie Mack was 24 years old. She had a son. She grew up in foster care and lived with instability long before she disappeared. She was last seen in Philadelphia and was eventually identified after years as one of the victims once known only by a placeholder name. The record of her life includes hardship, but hardship is not the whole of a person. She was a mother. She was someone who had endured disruption from childhood onward. Like many women later tied to this investigation, she moved through circumstances where danger was treated by society as routine, and where vulnerability could be exploited by someone who knew exactly how little urgency such disappearances often received. The names kept changing, the outcome didn't. Jessica Taylor was 20 years old. She had lived in New York and Washington, D.C. Her remains were found in Manorville in 2003, and additional remains were found years later during the Gilgo Beach searches. Reports noted that identifying marks on her body had been intentionally removed or damaged. That detail is not just gruesome. It suggests calculation. It suggests a murderer thinking about recognition, about delay, about what can be taken even after death. Jessica was young. That fact should stop the mind for a moment. 20. There's still so much unfinished life at 20. So much instability, yes, but also possibility. Whatever choices or risks shaped her days, she was more than the circumstances that made her vulnerable. Then there are the 4 women whose remains were found along Ocean Parkway in December of 2010, close together, wrapped in burlap. Their names became known nationally because of where they were found and how close those discoveries were to one another. But they should not be remembered only as a grouped category. Each life was distinct. Maureen Brainard-Barnes was from Groton, Connecticut. She was a mother of 2. She had become pregnant as a teenager, left high school, married young, and spent years trying to hold together a life under financial strain. Friends and family described her as funny, loving, and deeply connected to her children. When work and money became unstable, she turned at times to sex work as a way to survive. That fact is often mentioned in these cases as though it explains too much. It does not. It explains risk. It explains exposure. It does not reduce her humanity. In July of 2009, she traveled to New York and was staying at a motel. She spoke to a friend the night she disappeared and mentioned going out on a call. Then she was gone. Her remains were found more than a year later. Reports described her as bound with belts, one of which investigators later linked through DNA to Heuermann's wife. A detailed prosecutor cited not to implicate the wife, but to support the theory that hairs and household transfer connected victims back to the family home during periods when she was away. Melissa Barthelemy was 24 years old and from Buffalo. She had trained as a cosmetologist. She was close to her younger sister, Amanda. Like many people trying to build a life in New York, she navigated instability, side work, and the pressure of getting by. She disappeared in July of 2009. What followed is one of the most haunting elements of the case. The phone calls made to her family after she was gone. Amanda Barthelemy, still a teenager, answered calls from someone using Melissa's phone. The caller taunted her, asked degrading questions, and at one point told her that Melissa was dead. Those calls were traced to areas that included Midtown Manhattan and Massapequa. They are among the clearest examples in the public record of cruelty, extending beyond murder itself into a campaign of psychological torment. Melissa's death was not treated only as an act of violence against one woman, it rippled outward, deliberately, into her family. Megan Waterman was 22 years old and from Maine. She was the mother of a young daughter named Liliana. Her life had been marked by instability, including time in a youth center as a teenager and later economic struggle. She disappeared in June of 2010 from a motel in Hauppauge. Reports describe her as having spoken to people shortly before she vanished, still tethered to the ordinary expectations of the day, still existing in that final space where tomorrow appears to be intact. She was trying to support herself. She was a mother. She was loved. Those details are not sentimental additions. They are the truth of who she was. Amber Costello was 27 years old, originally from North Carolina, and had spent years struggling with addiction. She had also spent time trying to recover, trying to rebuild, trying to live differently. Family members and people who knew her described someone energetic, funny, and caring. Her disappearance in September of 2010 came with one of the most significant witness details in the case. A man at the house where she was staying later described an encounter with a client connected to a large first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche, a detail that would eventually matter enormously when the investigation was revived years later. Amber, too, was wrapped in burlap and left near the others. She was not just a body in a sequence. She was a woman in the middle of a struggle that had not erased her personality, her history, or her value. In May of 2010, months before the discovery of the Gilgo 4, another woman disappeared nearby under circumstances that drew police into the area where the remains were later found. Shannon Gilbert was 24 years old when she fled a client's home in Oak Beach during the early morning hours, making a frantic emergency call in which she said people were trying to kill her. Her disappearance led to the search that ultimately uncovered the first bodies linked to what became one of the most infamous serial murder investigations in recent American history. Officially, her death was later ruled an accident, but her family disputed that conclusion for years. Whether or not her death is directly connected to the same killer, her case is inseparable from the public story because she is the reason the search moved into those marshes and along that roadway. That is one of the painful ironies of this case. A woman running in terror through the dark helped reveal how many others had already been left there. By December of 2010, investigators searching along Ocean Parkway found Melissa Barthelemy. 2 days later, they found Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainard-Barnes. The four were close together, wrapped in burlap, arranged in a pattern that made it impossible to dismiss coincidence. What looked separate didn't hold that shape anymore. The following spring, more remains were discovered in nearby areas, linking back to earlier victims and widening the scope of the investigation. Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, additional unidentified victims, a child, a person known for years only as Peaches because of a tattoo. The landscape itself began to feel saturated with concealed history, as though the roadside brush and maritime scrub had been holding secrets in place for years, waiting for weather and police tape to bring them into view. The investigation stretched across administrations, rivalries, failures, and long periods of frustration. For years, the case became almost synonymous with delay. There were changes in police leadership. There were disputes about strategy and public communication. There were questions about whether opportunities had been missed earlier. Some evidence had always existed in fragmentary form. Phone records, witness recollections, victimology, dump site patterns, timelines of disappearance. But a pattern is not the same thing as a prosecutable case. By the time it started to come into focus, it wasn't something forming, it was something that had already been there. During those years, the public built its own mythology around the so-called Long Island serial killer. The case drew documentaries, online forums, theories, and endless speculation. That speculation often outran the facts and sometimes distorted them. What matters for this story is not every theory that circled the case, but the evidence that eventually converged with enough force to bring Rex Heuermann into focus. A key break came when investigators re-examined older witness information alongside newer analytical methods. Amber Costello's circle had described a client driving a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. Years later, investigators connected that description to Heuermann, who owned such a vehicle. They also analyzed cell site data tied to burner phones believed to have been used in contact with several victims. Those devices and contacts formed patterns around Midtown Manhattan, Massapequa Park, and the victims' final known movements. Investigators also looked at travel and household timelines, noting periods when Heuermann's wife and family were out of town during several of the charged killings. Then came the DNA work that transformed suspicion into something much harder to dismiss. Investigators recovered discarded items believed to have been used by Heuermann, including a pizza box collected from trash. DNA developed from that evidence was compared to hairs found on or near victims. Prosecutors later described mitochondrial DNA links consistent with Heuermann and members of his household. Hair evidence also connected some victims to the wife's DNA profile through transfer, which prosecutors used to support the conclusion that victims had come into contact with an environment tied to the home or household items, even as they made clear that she was not accused of participating in the crimes. The prosecution theory was not that the family knew, but that trace evidence carried the private world of that house into the places where the dead were found. That detail is hard to shake, not because it solves everything, but because it captures the way evil can move through ordinary objects. A strand of hair, a belt, a truck seen in a driveway. The things that compose daily life becoming part of a murder case years later. What looked like empty space wasn't. It just hadn't been looked at the right way yet. On July 13th, 2023, Rex Heuermann was arrested in Manhattan. Nothing about it suggested a beginning, only continuation. At first, he was charged in connection with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, and named as the prime suspect in the death of Maureen Brainard-Barnes. Later, prosecutors added charges involving Maureen, then Jessica Taylor, Sandra Costello, and Valerie Mack. In April of 2026, he pleaded guilty to 7 charged murders and admitted responsibility for Karen Vergata as well. By then, the public picture had changed again. The mystery that once seemed unknowable had narrowed into a legal record. Not complete, not emotionally complete certainly, but sharper, more defined. By then, it didn't need to be explained anymore. It only needed to be acknowledged. Still, the question that lingers in cases like this is not just what happened. It is how someone lives beside such acts. How he goes from meetings about permits and code violations to, according to the evidence, trolling for victims, arranging encounters, transporting bodies, maintaining silence, and returning to the visible life assembled around him. That is where the theme of darkness matters, not as poetry, not as embellishment, but as the only language broad enough to describe the private corrosion that appears to have deepened over time. Nothing in the public record suggests a sudden break, some dramatic moment when Rex Heuermann transformed from one kind of man into another. The evidence instead suggests duration, repetition, escalation across years. Victims in the 1990s, victims in the early 2000s, victims in 2009 and 2010. Different disposal sites, similar vulnerabilities, patterns of concealment. If that timeline holds as prosecutors laid it out, then what you are looking at is not an isolated explosion of violence. You are looking at a life in which violence had room to grow. By the time everything was finally seen together, it wasn't a discovery, it was a realization. Whatever had been there for a long time, and by then, it had already taken years with it. Still, there were warning signs in the broadest sense, though many were only visible in hindsight. The secrecy, the compartmentalization, the reported searches recovered later, the use of burner phones, the selection of women whose disappearances might not trigger immediate institutional urgency, the long stretches of time over which the case remained unsolved. But hindsight is not foresight. It is easy to call something obvious once it has been revealed. The harder truth is that many dangerous people do not look dramatic from the outside. They look busy, irritable, eccentric, married, employed, fixed in their routines. That is part of why cases like this strike such a deep nerve in the public imagination. They expose how little visible normalcy can actually prove. And yet this story cannot end with him, because ending with him would grant the structure its center back. It would return the frame to the man accused of building it. The better and more honest ending belongs to the women and to the people who spent years carrying them in memory, while the case stayed unresolved. Think of Maureen Brainard-Barnes not as a case file, but as a mother calling a friend before going out on a job, still inside the improvisations of survival, still trying to hold the line for her children. Think of Melissa Barthelemy as a sister whose absence was turned into a weapon against her family by the person who killed her. Think of Waterman as a young mother from Maine, whose daughter would grow up in the shadow of her disappearance. Think of Costello as a woman in recovery, funny and alive, trying to push back against addiction and vulnerability. Think of Jessica Taylor at 20 years old. Think of Valerie Mack and the instability she had already survived. Think of Sandra Costello, whose name was missing from her own death for years. Think of Karen Vergata, restored piece by piece through science long after she was killed. Their families lost far more than the headlines ever capture. They lost birthdays, calls, holidays, grandparent years, chances for repair, the ordinary future tense that disappears when someone is murdered. Siblings became advocates. Parents became investigators of their own grief. Loved ones learned to live with uncertainty and then with the brutal correction of certainty. Communities from Connecticut to Maine, from Buffalo to North Carolina, from Philadelphia to New York, were left with the knowledge that these women had moved through the world, carrying whole interior lives that did not protect them from being reduced, in death, to evidence. So say their names in full. Sandra Costello, Karen Vergata, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, Maureen Brainard-Barnes, Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, Lynn Costello. Remember that they were not built for tragedy. They were built for life, however difficult that life may have been. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, friends, workers, survivors, women with histories larger than the final places where they were found. If this story deserves a closer look, it is because their lives deserved more than what was done to them, and because the damage left behind did not end at the moment of death. It moved outward into families, neighborhoods, police files, highways, courtrooms, and public memory. Rex Heuermann now stands in history, not as the architect of some legend, but as the accused and admitted source of devastating harm. A man prosecutor said use secrecy, planning, and the cover of an ordinary life to carry violence across years. And yet, even that is not the truest measure of the story. The truest measure is what was taken from the women whose futures were cut off and from the people who loved them. That is what remains when the noise falls away. Not the mythology, not the spectacle, not the endless fascination with the man at the center of the charges. What remains are the names, the families, the empty spaces, the ache of delayed answers, and the fact that for years the darkness beneath one life cast a shadow over so many others. And when you step back and look at it, piece by piece, you start to see the structure behind it all. The small moments, the ignored warnings, the decisions that didn't seem important at the time, but were. Because this wasn't random, it wasn't sudden, it was built, brick by brick. This has been Killer Constructions. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.